There was a story that I told that connected with some devastating floods that happened in Trinidad, Grenada, and Belize. And on the back of that, I was able to talk to AUSIS, the finance chair, uh, and really connect what is happening technically here, theoretically here, to the devastation that's actually back home. Sometimes we could live in a bubble here and not connect it with the human element. That was my best moment. The worst moment, the weather. Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Bachoo. I'm a journalist from Trinidad and Tobago and also a member of Climate Track. And we are here at COP29. Welcome to the Caribbean Calabash podcast. I have with me 3 Climate Tracker fellows this year who are part of the Climate Justice Fellowship. I have Danielle Swain from Guyana, Palanco from Puerto Rico, and also Jervon Sands from the Bahamas. Guys, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. What an incredible journey we've had over the last 2 weeks. Filled with challenges, filled with very challenging times, very difficult moments, but that's COP for you. It's never going to be easy. It's not meant to be easy. I'm just going to start by asking you guys, what's the experience been like? I know for a couple of us here, it's our first time. For others, it's our second or third time. Danielle?
Oh, my experience at COP has been incredible. I have learned so much. I have met a lot of talented journalists. And I have also learned a lot from people younger than myself, which is amazing. And yeah, it has been a really good experience so far.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's the great thing about COP. You can learn from people who are younger than you, people who are the same age, older folks as well. It's a real learning experience. Carlos, what about you?
Well, it's been a little overwhelming. I'm not gonna lie to you, but I feel like I've also learned a lot from people older than me, people younger than me, journalists, people from delegations, NGOs. I feel like I've learned a lot more about kind of the global perspective on climate journalism and climate change versus like the perspective I used to have, which was just like Puerto Rico and the U.S.
First COP?
Yes.
Yeah, that was my word. That was my word actually after my first COP in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. Overwhelming. What about you, Jervon?
So for me, this is my second COP. My first was also in Sharm el Sheikh. But I think for me, COP29 has been a lesson in balance because this COP has been a lot. I've been here with Climate Tracker, here as a part of the Bahamas delegation negotiating in the Global Stocktake track. I've been involved with the Youth Negotiators Academy, who've been sending me around to different side events to kind of showcase all of that training and work that we put in over the course of this year. And so it's been quite a lot of fun, I'd say. I got to meet quite a lot of people as well and make really strong connections that I'm sure will last into the future. And I'll be seeing people at future COPs and like, you remember COP29 in Azerbaijan? And so I'm really looking forward to that coming out of this COP. But yeah, I had a great time.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I just want to find out a little bit about the stories that you guys have been telling. The good thing about this cast that we have is that it's really a dynamic crew. We've got Puerto Rico, which Carlos is from. We've got the Bahamas, where Jervon is from, and Danielle, of course, being from the oil and gas-based economy in Guyana. Now, tell me a little bit about some of those stories. That must have made an interesting COP for you, Danielle, telling climate change stories on the backdrop of the economy being dependent on oil and gas.
Yes, well, although we are now I wouldn't say dependent, but now that we have this inflow of cash from oil and gas, Guyana is still holding on to its roots of forest conservation and, having a strong indigenous presence in the country that makes sure that we hold on to those roots. I must say we have really strong civil society organizations that ensure that. But yes, it was interesting because I got to see Guyana on the global stage. And, I had to, kind of control my bias a bit because I was very proud of us and proud of our technical team, being able to own a lot of the research and so that we had. And that's not only for Guyana. I was really, really proud of the Caribbean delegation and the Latin American delegation, of the technical experts that we have. Everybody you talk to, they can break it down to you, like, for a 7-year-old, for a 6-year-old. I was so impressed of the knowledge that we have. And, it's not like external people coming and trying to defend our rights. We're defending our rights. I know the the older generation who set the foundation for us is very proud up there in heaven or hell. Yes.
That's a bad one. But you do make a very good point, and even as a Caribbean journalist myself, seeing our Caribbean people, even our prime ministers, come here and speak on behalf of the Caribbean, defend the Caribbean, especially with climate change, also makes me proud. What about you, Jervon? How have your stories been coming along? Do you want to tell us about some of the stories you've written?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest and most important story that I've written here so far has been about the track that I'm following, the global stocktake, and because it's been one of the more contentious issues here at COP29, and having that duality of being in the rooms as a negotiator and sort of following the track from that perspective, and then kind of stepping out of that and like looking at this with like the view of a journalist and saying, how do I share this? How do I communicate this with people who have no idea what the global stocktake is about or the UAE dialogue is about? And I think that was like a unique challenge for me. And so I spent a lot of time on that story trying to get the technical parts of it down to be able to communicate it to a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, like what's actually going on here at COP. Some of the other stories have just been kind of following that same trend, like telling people what this whole COP29 process, UNFCCC, really means and why it's relevant to our region. Like why should we care about it? And so that's been really exciting. It's been a process of talking to a lot of people from the region and kind of getting their perspectives on what this thing means, especially youth, because as a young negotiator in this space, I kind of share some of the same frustrations. And then also just as a journalist, I want to be able to amplify those voices from the Caribbean, who are young people here in this space doing amazing things.
I really love that point that you made, because around my first COP, and especially after my first COP, that was my motivation to tell stories back home, to make people, Caribbean people, understand why this is important, why it's impacting them, why things are changing so radically. What about you, Carlos? How has your storytelling been going?
Well, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, so it doesn't really have the isn't party to the negotiations here. It doesn't have the ability to advocate for itself. So a lot of the stories and videos that I've made or am currently working on are about how that lack of power in these spaces ends up affecting them, as like whatever negotiations are made here and decisions are taken here end up trickling down. So I've done stories about how Puerto Rico isn't part of the dialogue, and then about some of the NGOs and people who are here who are only here as observers and can't really negotiate there as well. So it's been very interesting to see how those power dynamics play.
All right. So it's been an interesting couple of weeks. We are now recording this on the final day of what should be the final day of COP29. We might run into overtime on Saturday or possibly even Sunday. I'm just interested from the young journalists that we have here. What do you make of the COP process? And just on the back of that, before I hand you over the mic, last week, Friday, midway point of COP, there was a letter that surfaced from climate change experts saying that the process does not work. And they called for a revamping of the process. This letter was actually signed by former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Christiana Figueres, who was the head of UN climate change, as well as Rockstrom, who's a very important climate scientist. What do you guys make, having seen it from your lens as a young journalist from the region, being here? What do you make of the process? And you can be unfiltered.
Well, for me, the process is very slow, and but I did expect that coming into it. But what I was again surprised with was that, despite I was a person, and I'm going to be honest, even as a journalist, who never really paid attention to climate change, because yes, Guyana is on the low, most of our population is in region 4 on the low coastal plain, and we are susceptible to floods. We had the great flood of 2005 that really damaged our economy and we had to bounce back from. But I was like, the developed nations are going to do what they want to do. They have always done that. And why should I care about it? But coming here has changed my perspective, because just as historically the developing nations, and especially us in the Caribbean, have always fought for our freedom, have always fought colonization, I see it in a different way now. I see that We are doing it now through education. We are doing it now through advocating for ourselves. And yes, the process may be slow, it may be convoluted, but we're being heard. We have a place that even I was so touched to see so many indigenous people in one place from all the different continents, Africa, Polynesia, Polynesian indigenous people from, Australia, New Zealand. It really touched me because it shows that people are fighting. It shows that even though the process may be slow, they're not giving up and they're still, pushing. And it, my thing is that if we don't have this, what? This is where we're on an equal field. What will we do? Do we want to give it to G20? We saw how that is going. Yes, that'll be quick, but what will be the outcome of that? So we have to be realistic. Anything that involves so many countries, it's gonna take long, but we have to trust the process. And when we don't trust it, we say we don't trust it, and we say why, and we move forward. So although I understand that maybe some changes need to be done, you can't just burn it down and be like, we're gonna scrap it. It serves a purpose. It's here for a reason.
Yeah, good point. The process might be slow, it might be frustrating, but it's the only process that we have. And as you said, at this United Nations Climate Change Conference, it might seem as though there are developed versus developing countries, but Danielle is right. Every country is on an equal footing here. The UN doesn't look at developed versus developing countries. Everybody has the same amount of time to speak and they have the same voice. Carlos, what about you?
I definitely think that it requires some reforms in order to be a more effective process, because while every country has the same amount of time to speak and time to be represented, coming in, they don't have the same resources or the same like political weight to throw around, if that makes sense. For example, the developed countries can throw their weight around much more than, like, let's say the AOSIS can, right? So it ends up being a kind of push and pull of power that I think in some ways needs reform, because AOSIS was asking for, I think, $39 billion. And the truth is that those $39 billion is probably just what one of those islands needs to adapt and mitigate and deal with the effects of climate change.
So that's a major part of the letter that was signed by Ban Ki-moon, Rockstrom, as well as Figueres, giving small island developing states, developing countries, a greater voice at COP. So that's a very good point that you made. How about you, Jervon?
I also believe that like a good amount of reform is required, but I also think that we have to try and ask a different question, because if we're asking, does the process work? It may work, but for who does it actually work? And obviously, for small and developing states, it's not been working in the way that we hope it will, for the sake of our nations, with the time running out on the climate clock. And so I think that it requires sort of a just reform and like overview of like where has this process been breaking down, and what can we do to resolve some of those issues so that it can work and it can be better for those who it should serve better than it has been. And so those who are most vulnerable to this crisis, because that's really what we set out to do in the beginning. And it doesn't seem like we've done that 30 years later. So we don't want to go another 30 years and then say we should have did something earlier.
Also want to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about the future, because what we have seen in the past with COP, and it exists to some extent, it still exists, is that the coverage of COP goes up, and then climate change sort of goes down for the rest of the year, and then it comes back up again closer to COP or even at COP. So climate change only sort of hits the headlines at COP, and that's not just for the Caribbean. Just wondering your plans as journalists post-COP, headed into 2025, Danielle.
Well, I think a lot has to do with how we tell the story. So I think for the future, I now understand that, climate justice is a human rights issue. And I think if we put human beings and our people at the center of the story, people can relate to it and understand, well, oh, well, I cannot get funding for this program, or taxes are going up because my government now has to, on the back of dealing with hurricane damage from last year to flooding damage from this year, cannot now put money into development for my country, for education, for health. And when you understand it on that level, and with the Caribbean being vulnerable in terms of food security as well, when you tell those stories of farmers from that level that people can relate to, I think that is how we're going to get our people to care about it and pay attention to it more than we just keep it at this complicated level. We need to really break that down and say, well, this is a human rights issue, and that's what I plan to do.
Okay, awesome. How about you, Carlos? What about your post COP climate career?
I don't know. That's a bit.
It's also okay to say that. Listen, this was hella boring, too complicated. I'm done with this. After it's okay to say that. You could be honest.
No. I don't think that's what I was gonna say. I think there's definitely important things to cover here and important stories that come out of here. But I mainly focus on climate change stories alongside with a few political stories. And at least in Puerto Rico, there's still people with like blue tarps over their houses from Hurricane Maria 7 years ago, or I guess almost 8 years now. Um, and the truth is that like while the coverage or like the international attention that climate change gets at COP or whenever there's a particularly devastating climate disaster, those shifts end up happening on the news media, not for the people or the places that we live in, the places that we cover, right? So I think it's a little bit about figuring out how to make sure that those stories continue being told throughout the year, not just whenever there's a big event like COP or a big disaster. So I think that's like the main issue that I'm going to keep grappling with until the next COP and probably forever.
Brilliant, Jervon. I'm going to hand you the mic.
Yeah, for me, I've been telling stories related to climate change and how it relates on the day-to-day to average Bahamians. But it is a challenge that, it's hard to get people to sort of come around this idea that this is important for your daily experience. And so I think what this COP has informed me of moving forward is that I need to kind of have more diversity in how I tell these stories. And like maybe have different forms of telling the story, because that would help me reach a wider audience. And then also try to tell the stories from the perspectives of the people who are frustrated about this, who are experiencing this issue and may not even know that they're experiencing it. And so trying to bring out the care for what this means for people on the ground from the community itself, and bring those stories to the fore, because on the day-to-day, there's a lot going on at home, and like people tend to kind of gravitate around what's sort of like the big picture, like the big story, the big moment happening right now. But climate change is kind of constant and it can be invisible at times. So we need to keep giving it the visibility that can help us garner that respect for how challenging and how vast this problem actually is.
All right, so I've got one more question for everybody. Give me as Climate Tracker Fellows, give me your best moment at COP and also your worst moment at COP. I can start. So my best one would be there was a story that I told that connected with some devastating floods that happened in Trinidad, Grenada, and Belize. And on the back of that, I was able to talk to AUSIS, the finance chair, and really connect what is happening technically here, theoretically here, to the devastation that's actually back home. Sometimes we could live in a bubble here and not connect it with the human element. That was my best moment. The worst moment, the weather. Danielle?
For me, my best moment was interacting with as I said before, the negotiators from all the islands from Latin America and from Guyana, and seeing how, again, smart they were, how knowledgeable they were, and just feeling very proud that we're in good hands and that we have people that are ready to defend us, regardless of political affiliation or whatever. These are the technical people that are on the ground and that have been around a long time and have that institutional knowledge. And that was my best moment that I'm most proud of. And my worst moment at COP was losing my suitcase.
Oh no.
But I also see it as a good thing because I learned that, always pack clothes in your carry-on and carry a bigger carry-on. Just don't carry a haversack. So that was a very, it was twofold.
I'm very sorry to hear that. Carlos, what about you?
Okay, so worst moments. I think there's two actually. One is getting pushed by UN security while I was covering a worker who was protesting because of low pay. Second is kind of seeing how the election of Donald Trump has kind of cast a shadow on some of the climate talks. Best is, I think, publishing stories. I like to publish. And then I have a few lined up for next week as well. So ideally, that's the best thing for me. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll start with my best moment, and I won't say it's yet to come. I think the best moment for me is getting to have community with young people from the Caribbean that are here who I've had the opportunity to connect with over the course of this year in different programs that we've been involved in, and then seeing sort of us come together here and being able to tell their story of being here. I think that's sort of the best moment for me. The worst moment was having to let the story that I came in here really wanting to do die, because there's just COP29 was not the place that story was, that there was anything for that story to be told. And so it was really hard because that's a story that's really important to SIDS, really important to the Bahamas. And it kind of sends a message that story wasn't here at COP29.
I do hope that you get the opportunity to tell it at least post COP29. And you can look out for all of the stories from Danielle, from Jervon. You can look out for Carlos's story, all on climatetracker.org. All of their stories that they've told over the last couple of weeks here at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan will be there. There's also the Caribbean Climate Justice Fellowship that's also happening as we speak. Those stories, incredible stories of what's happening in the Caribbean when it comes to the fight for climate justice. Those stories will also be on the Climate Tracker website at climatetracker.org. Also remember, follow Climate Tracker on their various platforms, including Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And until the next time on Caribbean Calabash Podcast, take care.